happy to have Joseph Gerson with us this evening. He is the director of the Peace and Security Program of American Friends Service Committee. He's the chair of the No to War, No to NATO committee. He is the author of 4 books about the American global military presence and nuclear policy. The most recent one being Empire and the Bomb, How the U.S. Uses Nuclear Weapons to Dominate the World. We're very happy to have him bring his expertise and his recent experiences at the NATO summit and protesting it in Poland last summer to us. NATO is a very puzzling phenomenon in ways in the current world. It was set up in 1949 as the Cold War divided Europe. It was one of the structuring military political alliances of that 4-decade conflict. Its founding General Secretary, Lord Ismay, once quipped that the purpose of NATO was to keep the Americans in Western Europe, the Soviets out, and the Germans down. Now, one would think, after 89 to 91, that NATO wouldn't have any particular purpose. Europe was no longer divided. The Soviet Union didn't exist. For better or worse, the Germans are certainly back with a vengeance. And America, as its politicians said after 89, considers itself a European power. So what is NATO doing? What are its roles and goals? Who calls the tune? We hope you'll shed light on that. We also hope you'll shed light on the question of how much it is NATO and the U.S. That are responsible for the deteriorating relationships with Russia. And if the U.S. and NATO bear a good part of that responsibility, how do we criticize our government without falling into some kind of romanticization of Putin's authoritarian regime in Russia? Should we think of this as a new Cold War? A lot of people use that, and it's a catchy title, but if it's 2 capitalist powers and there's not the ideological conflict, how do we understand? Is it a great power struggle of a more traditional sort? Is it a way for both Russians and Americans to divert attention from domestic problems by military posturing? And perhaps most importantly, what do we do in the face of NATO? If the demise of NATO, desirable as it might be, isn't likely in the short run, and I don't think it is, what are the other alternatives?
You'll notice the title has a question mark after a new Cold War. And I'm actually going to argue that it's not. It's something, a different kind of animal. I also want to point to the picture of the protest that you see there. That was from the counter-NATO summit in Warsaw. And what was interesting was the slogan that the Poles adopted was, "We've had Moscow, we don't want Washington." And I think that sort of communicates a lot. So again, to pick up from what Molly said, I think we need to understand the complexities of modern Russia, to understand that in many ways Putin is a modern czar with the kind of powers and ambitions that he has. But at the same time, I think we need to project into Russian historical experience. I mean, think for a moment how powerful the memory of Pearl Harbor is in framing the responses of people here in the United States to the wider world. Then consider for the Russians the impacts of Napoleon's invasion, the Kaiser's invasion, and Hitler's invasion, and how that devastated Russia. So as they're seeing, as I'll point out, as they're seeing NATO come to their borders, in part they're seeing a return of history that's not a particularly pleasant one. They're also confronted, the Russian military budget is 14% of the U.S. military budget. And so they're facing a reality in which the United States has an overwhelming dominance in conventional, high-tech, space, and cyber weapons, and maybe nuclear weapons as well. So again, this puts them in a defensive position in which they're responding, obviously, somewhat aggressively. It's a situation in which we know that they have essentially a KGB crony government. It's a particular kind of capitalism. The repression of free speech in the press, the assassination of opponents, are all things I think people committed to democratic values really repulsive. But at the same time, we have to deal with the situation as it is and to appreciate the complexities. The idea that the United States, with 2 million people in prison, for example, is the home of the free world, or that we have alliances with dictators and the Saudi government, we need to understand things with their complexity. At the time, or just before the NATO summit, the Anaconda War Games were held. These were by NATO. These were the largest war games since the end of the Cold War. 30,000 troops basically mobilizing across Poland. And this is the first time you had any kind of exercise like that in Eastern Europe. And interestingly is the wrong word, but what you had was the German foreign minister, Steinmeier, saying, what we shouldn't do now is inflame the situation further through saber-rattling and warmongering. He was essentially saying that the United States and NATO are engaged in warmongering at this time, the German foreign minister, our ally. There were, when I was in Europe, you heard competing interpretations of what he was doing. Was he doing in part to position himself for future political ambitions in Germany? But nonetheless, that this is part of the discourse in Western Europe, I think should sober us a little bit. Okay, so then to, again, speak to Molly's question, and borrowing a little bit from Michael Clare, who's really a fine scholar up in Massachusetts, I think the reality is that rather than being analogous to the Cold War, the current situation, which we all understand is very fluid, is more analogous to the period preceding World War I. And just to look at some of the dimensions here. You have a reality of rising and declining powers. With Russia, you have maybe a declining power, and maybe in some ways this is more appropriate talking about the United States and China. But then again, you have interesting ties and relations between Russia and China at the moment. But this is part of the global dynamic. We have very complex alliance structures that work in the world. Certainly NATO, but again, look at the Middle East and how those play out. Think in terms of Turkey in NATO, Erdogan just now going to Moscow. It's an interesting set of complexities. And again, in Asia, it's very complex. You have rising nationalism, as you had at the beginning of the previous century. In Russia, look at Trump here in the United States, in China, in Eastern Europe, look at Le Pen in France. So this is a period of, I would say, dangerous nationalism. More in Asia than in Europe, you have territorial disputes. Just to say that I have a few slides at the end, if there's time, in terms of the dimensions in Asia that we need to be thinking about, that I'll show. But these territorial disputes can trigger conflicts. We certainly have arms races with new technologies between the United States and Russia, competition in space, cyber weapons, hypersonic weapons, a whole new range of nuclear weapons on both sides. We have a situation, and again, less with, well, more with Europe and Russia than the United States. But we have a period of economic integration and competition. Again, we don't think about it very much here, but Germany and Russia have fairly deep economic integration. Think in terms of the dependence of much of Western Europe on the gas coming out of Russia. Think in terms of the German investments in Ukraine, for example. And it's interesting, at this conference, the Counter Summit I was at, there was a representative from Sweden who was talking about Sweden's great investments in Ukraine and how this all plays out with competing ambitions. Preceding World War I, you had deep economic integration, particularly Britain and Germany. The idea that war could be fought between these economic competitors, but also collaborators, was thought as beyond possibility. And of course, we also have the reality of wild card actors, be they in Ukraine or they be here in the middle of the U.S. political system. Let me summarize some of the outcomes of the Warsaw Summit. Again, The New York Times doesn't write a lot about it. You're certainly not going to find it on CBS or Fox News. And as this is increasingly defining the world that we live in, it's something we need to know about. So first, ostensibly in response to the civil war, the conflict in Ukraine, NATO committed to create 4 new combat brigades based in Poland, in Latvia, in Lithuania, and Estonia. And preceding this, to appreciate that the United States committed to quadruple its military spending for its forces in Europe. So a huge buildup here. NATO committed to continue to support and help modernize Ukraine's military and armed forces. It reaffirmed the nuclear alliance. We'll say more later about NATO as a nuclear alliance. But as it's been described, it indirectly warned Russia that the alliance's capabilities were far greater than those of Russia. One of the interesting elements, again, we don't think about here very much, is you go back several U.S. administrations, and there's been constant pressure on European countries to increase their military spending. Gates, for example, went to his valedictory speech, and one of the problems with Europe is not enough of those countries are spending 2% of their GDP on the military, right? We spend about 4% here in the United States. But to appreciate, among other things, that Europe has been in a period of economic crisis and austerity since 2008. And the idea of increasing military spending at a time when their social services in many countries are collapsing is more than a little bit of a problem. And interestingly, Greece spends more than 2% of its GDP to this day on the military. But this is within the European left and other sectors as well, real concern about this pressure to increase the spending. There was a recommitment to provide financial support to the Afghan government and its military forces. Symbolically, this was an opportunity to basically to assume NATO command and operational status for U.S. missile deployment forces in Romania, and construction is underway now for missile defense in Poland. And finally, and interestingly, NATO is increasing its work on maritime patrols, both in the Western Mediterranean in relationship, say, to Libya and migrants coming there, and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And while many of us perceive it, and as it's been sold as a way to try to be a humanitarian effort to ensure that people don't die in the water, there's strong concern that this also serves as a to legitimize pre-positioning of U.S. forces in relationship, particularly to Russia. These two maps, I think, will help to illustrate, if you will, the kind of growing tensions from both sides. I won't kind of spend a long time here. But then to go into, we already had the quote from Barron dismay. And I found myself thinking, he was the first Secretary General of NATO, and he had a long title. And I found myself thinking, when I took constitutional law a million years ago, they tell you that constitutional law and the rulings of the Supreme Court are actually kind of the ruling of the dead hand of history on the present. The old precedents are brought forward from way back when. I mean, there's a struggle now, I think, over a statue of Chief Justice Taney, who was responsible for the Dred Scott decision. But these things continue to have their influence. And so to understand that now, 65 years ago or so, this particular culture, that particular time, still manifests itself today. Okay, so then let's look at the geostrategy of the situation. Really, why is the United States there? How does it work? Some of you will be familiar with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He wrote a book after he was out of office called The Grand Chessboard. And it basically is a primer for his students as to how to maintain what he calls the imperial project of the United States. And what he argues, is that, going back to old geostrategic thinking, whoever controls Eurasia, and especially we would say the eastern end of Eurasia, whoever controls that dominates the world. And much as Britain was an island power that exercised enormous power, the United States is in geostrategic terms an island power, far away from Eurasia. So what are the prerequisites for the United States to have that dominant role over Eurasia? And he says what it is the United States has to maintain toeholds on Eurasia's western, southern, and eastern peripheries. And so NATO has provided the foundation of that toehold on the western periphery of Eurasia. Our dominance in the Middle East since 1945, the intervention into Afghanistan provided the foundations from the south, and the combination of particularly the United States alliance with Japan. Basically, we occupied it, reframed the country to serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, as one prime minister called it, for the United States. In South Korea, the Philippines, we have our toehold on the eastern frontier. And then, we think of NATO as, we still, our minds are still caught, it's understandable, in Cold War frames of reference. So, we still think in terms of NATO as a Western European force that's there to prevent the Russians from coming further to the west. But as you see here, it's really become a global alliance. I'll say a little bit more in a minute about its expansion, beginning in 1992 with Bill Clinton. But it's moved all the way into Eastern Europe. It's moved to the borders of Russia. Updating this, and you have the complexity under the NATO members of Turkey, and it being now a bit of a wild card. To appreciate that in the middle of the coup, the United States had nuclear weapons based in Turkey, and concern as to what was going to happen with those nuclear weapons. And looking down at the NATO partner nations, Montenegro, that major power Montenegro, that country which is so threatened from the east, is now a full member of NATO. And you'll also see in that list Sweden and Finland. And while Sweden and Finland are not formal members of NATO, they increasingly are functional members of NATO. The United States has been conducting, NATO has been conducting major military exercises, especially in northern Sweden, for almost a decade now. And you have deep integration with their militaries and governments with the West. And then you see, and I'll come back later, to Mediterranean dialogue partners, the Istanbul Initiative, and partners across the globe, including these major European powers like Pakistan and the Philippines. So then, one of the other questions, of course, is in this fluid situation, and we are in an unusually fluid situation, what does the Brexit vote in England portend for NATO? Clearly, it signals a weakening of the European Union. We're going to have to wait a few years to see quite how things play out in the rest of Europe in terms of their elections, as you have nationalist authoritarian governments, and we already have a fascist government in Hungary. Poland is extreme right. We don't know how the elections are going to go in France. And in some ways, you've got, of course, the historical problems, to say the least, between Poland and Russia. But on the other hand, thinking especially in terms of France and Hungary, you have these authoritarian governments, right, who are less oriented toward the kind of neoliberalism of the United States, and maybe more towards the authoritarian models of Putin. So how this plays out and what its stability is, we don't know. But what we, I think, can expect, and what I certainly heard when I was in Europe, is to expect that the European elites and the US elites are, in this context, going to put more of their political and other capital into reinforcing NATO. If the EU becomes wobbly, well, we still have NATO to serve as the dominant force in our lever there. The other thing that just needs to be mentioned is that while we have this deep competition with Russia, there are also some common interests. And it's interesting, Brzezinski has a recent article, I think in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, in which he's saying that in the coming decades, as we can see already in the Middle East, we're likely to see increasing blowback from what literally are centuries of colonialism and oppression in the global South, and to expect more resistance coming to the global North in response to that. And so he's pointing to common interests. If you look, for example, at Russia, really their biggest security threat is Islamist extremism and the long history of, if you will, Russian imperial dominance in portions of what we understand is southern Russia and Central Asia, right? And some of this is blowing back into Russia, blows back into China. And Brzezinski is pointing to some commonality of interest in terms of resisting what we call the extremist violence. And we also see, we don't know how it's going to play out, perception of how this comes together in Syria. We'll see where Kerry's negotiations and the ceasefire goes, but it points to some commonality of interest. I was telling Molly, when I was a freshman at Georgetown, sophomore at Georgetown, with a fellow student named Bill Clinton, we had a course in international relations. And the second sentence out of the mouth of our professor of international relations was that the study of international relations is analogous to studying the rules of the game among mafia families. And so on the one hand, you have the viciousness of these powers, but sometimes they also have some common interests. I mean, one of the other unhappy common interests is that the P5 nuclear powers, the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain, in many ways, even as they're targeting one another, collaborate. So they've been resisting efforts of really much of the rest of the world to implement their commitments under Article 6 of the NPT to negotiate the abolition of nuclear weapons. And you're going to see more of that fighting at the UN this month. So I think we do need to recognize some of that ambiguity as we go forward. And then, again, to understand the current context. Years ago, I read George Kennan, the author of the famous containment doctrine. He wrote a kind of a history of U.S. foreign policy, I think from 1898 to 1951. And one of the things he wrote in there, and he'd been the ambassador in Moscow during the war. He wrote that the reality was that because the Russians both suffered what they did in the war, and the fact that they pushed the Nazis back to Germany, the reality was we had to accept a division of Europe. And that was codified in Yalta. And to appreciate, despite the kind of ideology and the propaganda we had during the Cold War, for the most part, the Soviet Union respected the divisions of Yalta. I mean, it wasn't nice if you were in Eastern European to be occupied and serving as a buffer for Russia, given that history of interventions. But for example, in the almost in the immediate aftermath of the war, there was a struggle for power in Greece between communists who'd been aligned with Moscow and monarchists who'd been allied with the Nazis. The United States allied with the monarchists. And Greece was to fall within the Western sphere as opposed to the Soviet sphere. And Stalin, not a nice guy, nonetheless cut off the assistance to the communists in Greece. The monarchists won, and we had a right-wing Greece for a long time because of that. To appreciate, of course, we had the Cold War history with both the Berlin crises. You had the, many people came into the movement in the late 70s and early 80s when we had the missile crisis with both sides building up their nuclear arsenals. And at that point, we thought 5 minutes to midnight was extremely dangerous, along with Reagan. Bulletin Atomic Scientist now says we are at 3 minutes to midnight. And we are at that degree of danger. Yeah, so then I want to say a few words about NATO as a nuclear alliance. And again, there's more to it than meets the eye. The U.S. had nuclear weapons, in Europe from early on. We used our nuclear threat during the 2 Berlin crises. But one of the concerns, especially with de Gaulle, was a fear of what was called decoupling. That Western Europe might decide it was not entirely in its interest to hold so tight with the United States. And so to help hold them in, and again we're dealing with the rules of the game among mafia families, basically they created a thing called the NATO planning group, nuclear planning group. And this integrated European militaries and their senior elites into the nuclear planning for Europe, gave them, if you will, a stake in preparations for the elimination of the human species. This then was reiterated at the Portugal summit in 2010, where they said that NATO should continue to maintain secure and reliable nuclear forces with widely shared responsibility for deployment and operational support.